In the autumn of 1839, nestled within the misty valleys of western Virginia, authorities uncovered a horror that would shake the very foundation of American society. 23 children, ranging in age from 5 to 15 years, were discovered chained in a hidden cellar beneath a stately country manor owned by the respected Thompson family. The children spoke different dialects, bore signs of prolonged captivity, and when questioned by authorities, could only whisper one name through their tears: Father Thompson. The county sheriff's records, sealed away for decades in the Alleghany County Archives, described scenes so disturbing that 2 deputies immediately tendered their resignations, unable to continue their duties after witnessing such depravity. What makes this case truly chilling isn't merely the discovery itself, but the terrifying revelation that Jeremiah Thompson, a pillar of Virginia society, had been conducting his sinister operation for nearly 15 years without arousing suspicion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Thompson estate stood as a monument to Southern prosperity, its white columns and manicured gardens hosting the most prestigious social gatherings in the county. Yet beneath this facade of genteel respectability lurked an evil so profound that it continues to haunt Virginia's history to this day. Before we delve deeper into the darkness of the Thompson cellar, I want to ask you something important. This channel explores forgotten chapters of history that many would prefer remain buried. If you've watched this far, you possess the courage to face uncomfortable truths that most people avoid. So take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our community of historical truth seekers. Tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from? Would you believe similar horrors might have happened in your own hometown? The question that continues to baffle historians and criminologists alike is how Jeremiah Thompson maintained his facade of respectability while orchestrating such monstrous crimes. How could 23 children vanish into the Thompson estate without raising alarms in a close-knit Virginia community? The answer lies in a perfect storm of social circumstances, calculated deception, and the inherent vulnerabilities of a society in transition. The Virginia of 1839 stood at a crossroads. The agricultural traditions that had defined the Commonwealth for generations were beginning to feel the first tremors of industrialization creeping down from the northern states. Old social structures remained firmly entrenched while new economic realities created unprecedented disruption. Amidst this changing landscape, the small town of Millfield represented a bastion of traditional Virginia life, with approximately 40 families spread across the lush valleys of Alleghany County. Most residents cultivated tobacco or raised livestock, traded at Whitaker's General Mercantile, and gathered for social occasions at the brick courthouse that anchored the town square. The Thompson estate, known locally as Elmwood, was situated 3 miles outside Millfield proper, a sprawling property encompassing over 300 acres of prime Virginia farmland. The main house, an imposing Greek Revival structure with 6 towering columns, had been completed in 1825, replacing an older farmhouse that had stood on the property since colonial times. To travelers journeying along the Richmond Pike, Elmwood represented the epitome of Southern prosperity and refinement. Jeremiah Thompson had inherited the property from his father, a successful tobacco merchant, in 1824. Already in his 40s when he took possession of Elmwood, Thompson quickly established himself as a community leader, serving on the county board of supervisors and generously contributing to local causes. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away in 1821, leaving him a childless widower whose apparent dedication to philanthropic endeavors earned him universal respect. What distinguished Elmwood from neighboring estates wasn't apparent to casual visitors. The cellar beneath the main house had been extensively modified during a series of renovations that Thompson initiated shortly after taking ownership. While most Virginia homes featured simple root cellars for food storage, The excavations beneath Elmwood extended far beyond the foundation of the house itself, creating a warren of underground chambers invisible from the surface. Local stonemasons and carpenters recalled being hired for various projects throughout the late 1820s and early 1830s, though none had seen the completed work in its entirety. Thompson employed an unusual method, engaging different workers for separate sections of the cellar's construction, paying handsomely in gold coins, and insisting on strict confidentiality regarding the specifications. His explanation, that he was creating specialized storage for his valuable wine collection and agricultural experiments, satisfied most questions. Thompson's reputation in Millfield was that of an eccentric but benevolent bachelor, whose primary passion was educational reform. Beginning around 1825, he began informing neighbors that he had established a private academy for disadvantaged children from distant counties. The endeavor, he explained, was his tribute to Eleanor, who had always wished for children of their own and had harbored a special concern for orphans and the impoverished. This educational institution, Thompson claimed, operated on revolutionary principles that required minimal contact with the outside world during the formative years of instruction. The children, he explained, came primarily from troubled backgrounds, orphans, abandoned youngsters, and children of destitute families who had willingly signed guardianship over to the Thompson Educational Trust in hopes of giving their offspring a better future. The arrangement satisfied the community's curiosity about the occasional sightings of children on the estate grounds. When questioned about why these children were never seen in town or at church gatherings, Thompson offered elaborate explanations about his specialized educational philosophy, citing European boarding school models and the need for structured environments free from external distractions. Martha Whitaker, who operated the general store alongside her husband, recalled that Thompson would visit twice monthly with extensive shopping lists. Mr. Thompson was always particular about his purchases, she later testified. He bought in quantities that seemed appropriate for a small school, significant amounts of flour, cornmeal, salt pork, and other staples. Nothing that would raise suspicion, just larger amounts than a single man might need. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What did strike Mrs. Whitaker as unusual was Thompson's specific request for medical supplies, quantities of laudanum, witch hazel, and various salves and bandages that seemed excessive even for a school environment. When she inquired about these purchases, Thompson explained that many children arrived with various ailments requiring treatment, and that the remote location of Elmwood necessitated maintaining a well-stocked infirmary. Dr. James Harrison, who served as Millfield's physician, recalled being called to Elmwood approximately twice yearly to address what Thompson described as health concerns among the students. Curiously, Dr. Harrison was never permitted to examine the children directly. Instead, Thompson would describe symptoms in detailed medical terminology and request specific treatments. "I found his behavior unusual," Dr. Harrison later stated. But Mr. Thompson possessed considerable medical knowledge, explaining that he had studied medicine briefly in Philadelphia before returning to manage the family estate. His descriptions were always precise and clinically accurate, so I had little reason to doubt his assessments. The local clergy, represented by Reverend Thomas Abernathy of Millfield Presbyterian Church, similarly accepted Thompson's explanations. Regarding the absence of his students from Sunday services, Thompson had convinced the minister that many of the children came from non-Protestant backgrounds, and that religious instruction was handled internally through carefully designed scriptural studies appropriate to each child's faith tradition. In reality, as investigators would later discover, Jeremiah Thompson had been perfecting his elaborate deception for over 15 years. The children hidden beneath Elmwood were not students receiving revolutionary education. They were captives, acquired through a sophisticated network of criminal associates operating throughout Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. The first hints of the truth began to emerge in the unusually wet September of 1839. Persistent heavy rains had saturated the ground throughout Alleghany County, causing numerous issues with drainage and foundation stability in many local structures. On September 17th, Samuel Jenkins, a stonemason hired to address water seepage in Elmwood's foundation, made a discovery that would set in motion the unraveling of Thompson's carefully constructed facade. Jenkins had been working along the eastern wall of the mansion when he noticed an unusual construction feature, a narrow drainage channel that seemed to extend well beyond the normal parameters of the house foundation. Following this anomaly, he discovered what appeared to be a concealed ventilation shaft, cleverly disguised as an ornamental garden feature. As Jenkins investigated further, he heard something that froze his blood, the unmistakable sound of a child crying, emanating from somewhere beneath the ground where no child should be. The sound was quickly silenced, followed by a harsh adult voice issuing threats in hushed tones. Jenkins, the father of 4 young children himself, completed his assigned work without revealing his discovery. That evening, he approached Sheriff William Crawford with his suspicions. Crawford, a cautious and methodical lawman who had served Alleghany County for over a decade, initially hesitated to investigate one of the community's most prominent citizens based solely on unusual architecture and ambiguous sounds. However, Jenkins was not easily dismissed. "I know the sound of a frightened child, Sheriff," he insisted, "and no amount of fancy stonework can disguise the sound of chains dragging across a floor." Crawford agreed to make an informal visit to Elmwood the following day, ostensibly to discuss Thompson's recent complaints about trespassing on the northern boundaries of his property. The sheriff's plan was simple: observe the premises for any irregularities while conducting legitimate county business. The visit on September 18th proceeded uneventfully until Crawford requested a tour of the recent foundation repairs, explaining that similar issues had been reported at the courthouse. Thompson, normally composed and articulate, showed uncharacteristic anxiety at this suggestion, claiming that the work areas were unsafe and offering to provide detailed reports from the stonemasons instead. As their conversation continued on the main floor of the mansion, Crawford noticed several unusual features that confirmed Jenkins' suspicions. Heavy draperies covered what appeared to be ventilation grates in the floor of Thompson's study. A cabinet in the dining room concealed what looked like a small dumbwaiter system. Most tellingly, a locked door in the kitchen, which Thompson quickly explained away as access to the wine cellar, featured an unusual number of heavy-duty locks. The most damning evidence came when a thunderstorm erupted during Crawford's visit. As lightning struck nearby and thunder shook the mansion, a chorus of frightened cries briefly echoed through the floorboards, the unmistakable sounds of multiple children in distress. Thompson's explanation that the noise came from the stable, where several horses were disturbed by the storm, might have satisfied a less observant visitor. But Sheriff Crawford had heard enough to justify a formal investigation. The following morning, September 19, 1839, Crawford returned to Elmwood accompanied by 3 deputies and carrying a properly executed search warrant. Thompson met them at the entrance, his previous cordiality replaced by cold fury. He demanded to see the warrant, questioned its legality, and threatened legal action against the county for harassment and defamation. "You have no idea what forces you're challenging, Crawford," Thompson reportedly said. "There are people in Richmond who will ensure your badge is taken before the week is out." Nevertheless, the search proceeded. The initial inspection of the main house revealed nothing unusual beyond the architectural anomalies Crawford had previously noted. It was only when the officers insisted on access to the locked door in the kitchen that Thompson's composure finally shattered. "What lies beyond that door is private," he declared. "Educational materials and methods that would be misunderstood by the common mind. I'll not have ignorant lawmen disrupting my life's work." When Thompson refused to provide the keys, Deputy Samuel Wilson forced the door with an iron pry bar. What they discovered behind it would haunt the officers for the remainder of their lives. Instead of the expected wine cellar, the door opened onto a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Lanterns revealed stone walls that glistened with moisture, and as the officers descended, the temperature dropped noticeably. At the bottom of the stairs, they encountered another locked door, this one reinforced with iron bands. After breaking through this second barrier, Sheriff Crawford and his deputies entered a large chamber approximately 30 feet square, with a ceiling barely 6 feet high. The stench that assaulted them was overwhelming, a combination of human waste, unwashed bodies, and the sickly sweet odor of infection and decay. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, the full horror of the scene became apparent. 23 children, ranging from what appeared to be age 5 to approximately 15, were secured to the walls and floor by iron chains. Each child wore a metal collar connected to a ring embedded in the stone wall, with additional shackles at their ankles. The chains allowed limited movement within small, individually defined areas marked by chalk lines on the floor. The children themselves presented a shocking sight. Emaciated to the point of skeletal appearance, many showed signs of prolonged physical abuse, scarring, improperly healed fractures, and open wounds. Their clothing consisted of crude, shapeless garments fashioned from rough sacking material. Most concerning to Crawford was their complete silence upon the officer's entrance, not cries for help or expressions of relief, but a terrified, submissive stillness that spoke of spirits thoroughly broken. Deputy Wilson, overcome by the scene, immediately retreated up the stairs to vomit. Another deputy, James Foster, a hardened veteran of the War of 1812, was observed to weep openly as he surveyed the children's condition. Sheriff Crawford, maintaining his professional composure through sheer force of will, ordered Thompson secured while he continued the investigation. The central chamber, horrific as it was, represented only the beginning of the officers' discoveries. 5 additional rooms extended from this main area, each designed for specific purposes that revealed the methodical nature of Thompson's operation. The first auxiliary room appeared to be a punishment chamber, containing various restraining devices, whips, and other implements clearly designed to inflict pain without causing permanent disability. Records found in Thompson's study would later reveal his systematic approach to discipline, with detailed notes on each child's pain threshold and behavioral responses to correction. The second room functioned as a crude medical facility, where children were treated for injuries and illnesses, not from compassion, but to maintain their physical viability. Shelves lined with medicines, bandages, and basic surgical tools suggested that Thompson personally administered all medical care to ensure no outside contact. The third chamber was particularly disturbing, a small room containing a desk, chair, and extensive documentation. Here, Thompson had maintained meticulous records of each child, name or assigned designation, origin, date of acquisition, physical characteristics, educational progress, and behavioral assessments. These clinical notations, written in Thompson's elegant script, revealed the full scope of his operation and its duration. The fourth room appeared to be a storage area for food, water, and basic supplies needed to maintain the underground population. Interestingly, this room featured the highest quality items, preserved foods, clean water barrels, and even fresh fruits, suggesting that Thompson understood the minimum requirements to keep his captives alive and functional. The final chamber, accessible only through a narrow tunnel that required adults to crawl, contained the most horrifying evidence of all. Here, in a space no larger than 10 feet square, investigators discovered the remains of at least 9 children. Some appeared to have died from disease or malnutrition, while others showed clear evidence of fatal trauma. All had been buried in shallow graves beneath the earthen floor, with lime scattered over the bodies to control decomposition and odor. As the children were carefully removed from their chains and brought above ground, the full psychological impact of their captivity became apparent. Many seemed unable to comprehend that rescue had arrived, continuing to observe chalk boundaries even after their shackles were removed. Some appeared to have no language capabilities beyond basic responses, while others spoke in fragmentary phrases that mixed various dialects and languages. Most disturbing was their reaction to Thompson himself. When he was led past the children, on his way to the sheriff's wagon, several fell to their knees in a gesture of supplication, while others covered their eyes or turned to face the wall, conditioned responses that suggested elaborately enforced rituals of subservience. Thompson himself maintained a chilling composure throughout the initial arrest process. "You understand nothing of what you found," he reportedly told Sheriff Crawford. "These children were abandoned by society long before they came into my care. I have given them purpose, structure, discipline, elements absent in their previous existence." This calm demeanor would later deteriorate during formal questioning, but Thompson's initial reaction suggested a man who genuinely believed in the righteousness of his actions, a psychological profile that experts would debate for decades afterward. News of the discovery spread rapidly throughout Alleghany County and beyond. By nightfall on September 19th, crowds had gathered outside the Millfield courthouse where Thompson was being held. The public reaction mixed horror, disbelief, and increasing anger as details emerged about the conditions in which the children had been kept. The immediate challenge facing authorities was the medical care and accommodation of the rescued children. Dr. Harrison, assisted by physicians summoned from neighboring counties, established a temporary hospital in the Millfield School building. Initial examinations confirmed the worst fears about the children's physical condition: severe malnutrition, multiple improperly healed fractures, infections, and evidence of systematic physical abuse dating back years. The psychological assessment proved even more troubling. Many children appeared unable to provide basic information about themselves, including their original names or places of origin. Those who could communicate revealed fragments of their capture or acquisition, stories of being taken from orphanages, purchased from desperate families, or simply abducted from streets in distant cities. One child, a boy estimated to be about 12 years old, who could only identify himself as number 7, provided the first insights into the purpose of Thompson's operation. Through halting, broken speech, he described a routine of daily lessons that had nothing to do with traditional education. "Father teaches obedience," the boy explained. "Perfect stillness, perfect silence, perfect service." These lessons included extensive periods of enforced immobility, memorization of elaborate codes of conduct, and punishment for the slightest infractions. As investigators continued to study Thompson's records and interview the more communicative children, a disturbing pattern emerged. Jeremiah Thompson had been systematically conditioning children for what he termed in his journals placement with appropriate households, a euphemism for selling trained servants to wealthy families throughout the South. The discovery at Elmwood represented only the current class of children undergoing Thompson's brutal conditioning process. His records indicated that over the previous 15 years, he had processed and placed approximately 78 children with various buyers. These transactions were disguised as legitimate apprenticeships or adoptions, complete with falsified documentation that Thompson had meticulously prepared. The investigation expanded rapidly as authorities recognized the scope of Thompson's operation. Federal marshals became involved when evidence suggested trafficking across state lines. Agents were dispatched to locate previous graduates of Thompson's system, many of whom had been placed with prominent families in Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland. As the investigation deepened, the sophisticated nature of Thompson's network became apparent. He had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials at orphanages who would identify children with no family connections or visitors. He maintained contacts among the urban poor who could identify vulnerable street children unlikely to be missed. Most disturbingly, he had established a network of scouts who traveled through impoverished rural areas, offering to take children to educational opportunities in exchange for modest payments to desperate families. The financial records seized from Thompson's study revealed the profitability of his enterprise. Children purchased for as little as $5 from destitute families or simply taken from the streets at no cost could be conditioned and sold for between $200 and $500 to wealthy buyers seeking obedient, thoroughly broken servants who would never challenge authority or attempt escape. The community of Millfield reacted to these revelations with a combination of horror and collective guilt. How had they failed to recognize the truth behind Thompson's facade? Why had no one questioned the absence of his supposed students from community life? The uncomfortable answers involved the power of social standing, the unquestioning respect accorded to wealth and education, and the community's willingness to accept plausible explanations rather than confront disturbing possibilities. Martha Whitaker, reflecting on her interactions with Thompson over the years, expressed the sentiment shared by many. He presented himself as a gentleman of learning and charity. We saw what we expected to see, what we wanted to see. None of us looked deeper because the truth was too monstrous to contemplate. As September turned to October, the investigation continued to uncover the full extent of Thompson's operation and its connections to broader criminal networks. The 23 children rescued from Elmwood represented just the visible portion of a system that had processed over 100 victims during its years of operation. The question that would haunt investigators, community members, and historians for generations to come was deceptively simple, yet profoundly disturbing. How could one man, operating alone, maintain such an extensive criminal enterprise without detection? The answer would prove to be as complex as it was unsettling, revealing vulnerabilities in social structures, legal systems, and human psychology that extended far beyond the boundaries of Alleghany County. The discovery at the Thompson estate had opened a window into an aspect of American society that many preferred to ignore: the exploitation of society's most vulnerable members and the ease with which evil could hide behind respectability when protected by wealth, status, and carefully maintained appearances. As autumn deepened in the Virginia highlands, the 23 children began their long journey toward recovery, while investigators continued to unravel the threads of a conspiracy that would ultimately implicate individuals from all levels of society. The Thompson case was just beginning, and its full impact on American law, social services, and public consciousness would not be fully understood for decades to come. The story of what happened at Elmwood is not merely a historical curiosity or a macabre tale to shock modern sensibilities. It represents a crucial lesson about vigilance, about the danger of accepting appearances without question, and about our collective responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If you're finding value in uncovering these forgotten chapters of American history, take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate the importance of confronting difficult truths. In our next segment, we'll explore how the investigation expanded beyond Millfield, revealing connections to prominent families and institutions that had benefited from Thompson's cruel enterprise. We'll examine the legal proceedings that followed, the fate of Jeremiah Thompson himself, and the long-term impact of the case on American child protection laws. The darkness that was uncovered in that Virginia cellar would ultimately bring light to one of the most shadowed corners of 19th century society. As federal marshals arrived in Millfield to assist with the expanding investigation, the true complexity of Jeremiah Thompson's operation began to emerge. What had initially appeared to be the isolated crimes of a deranged individual gradually revealed itself as something far more systematic and far-reaching. The meticulous records found in Thompson's study provided investigators with names, dates, and locations that painted a disturbing picture of organized child trafficking extending well beyond Virginia's borders. Marshal Daniel Hartwell, who led the federal investigation, had spent the previous 5 years pursuing similar cases across the eastern seaboard. "The Thompson operation represents the most sophisticated network we've encountered," he noted in his initial report to Washington. "The level of documentation, the financial arrangements, and the connections to respectable society all indicate an enterprise of unprecedented scope and duration." The ledgers seized from Elmwood contained entries dating back to 1824, the very year Thompson had inherited the estate. Each entry followed a consistent format: identification number, source location, acquisition cost, conditioning period, and final placement with corresponding payment received. The clinical precision of these records reflected Thompson's background. Before returning to Virginia to claim his inheritance, he had spent several years studying both medicine and business management in Philadelphia. What struck investigators most forcefully was the calculated progression of Thompson's enterprise. The earliest entries showed modest operations, individual children acquired from urban poorhouses for small sums, subjected to basic conditioning, and sold locally as domestic servants. By 1830, the operation had expanded significantly, with multiple children being processed simultaneously and a widening geographic scope for both acquisition and placement. The financial records told their own chilling story. Thompson's initial transactions generated modest profits. Children purchased for $5 to $10 and sold for $50 minus 75. By 1839, he was regularly paying network suppliers $25 to $50 per child and receiving $300 to $500 for each graduate of his conditioning program. The total profits over 15 years exceeded $30,000, an enormous sum equivalent to over $1 million in today's currency. One of the most valuable sources of information came from a child initially identified only as number 17, a girl approximately 15 years old who had been at Elmwood longer than any other survivor. As her physical health improved, under proper medical care, she began to speak more freely, eventually revealing her true name, Elizabeth Collins. Elizabeth had been taken from a Baltimore orphanage in 1835 at age 11. Having been identified by one of Thompson's scouts as a suitable candidate due to her intelligence and lack of family connections. Her 4 years in the cellar had given her unique insights into Thompson's operation, as she had been assigned certain supervisory duties over newer arrivals. "Father would tell us we were fortunate," Elizabeth explained during a formal interview conducted in early October. "He said the outside world had rejected us, but he saw our potential. The training was necessary to make us valuable. Those who completed the program successfully would be rewarded with placement in fine homes. Those who resisted—" Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Elizabeth's testimony provided crucial details about the daily routine within the cellar. Children were awakened before dawn and required to stand at attention beside their sleeping pallets. Thompson would descend for morning inspection, check in cleanliness, posture, and compliance. Any infractions were noted for later punishment. Meals were minimal: thin porridge in the morning, bread and water at midday, and a slightly more substantial evening meal that included small portions of salted meat or beans. "The lessons began after morning meal," Elizabeth continued. "We learned to move silently, to anticipate commands without being told, to remain perfectly still for hours at a time. Father said this was what made us superior to ordinary servants. Our ability to exist without being noticed until needed." The curriculum Elizabeth described involved no reading, writing, or traditional education. Instead, children were taught elaborate rituals of subservience, proper forms of address for different social classes, techniques for anticipating an employer's needs, and methods for becoming invisible in wealthy households. Punishments. for failures in these lessons were severe and calculated to maximize pain without leaving permanent marks that might reduce a child's market value. Most disturbing was Elizabeth's description of the final examinations that preceded a child's placement. Potential buyers would visit Elmwood, ostensibly as social guests, and Thompson would demonstrate his methods using children who were nearing the end of their conditioning. These demonstrations took place in a specially prepared room on the main floor, with the child performing various services, while maintaining perfect silence and showing no reaction to deliberate provocations. He would tell them to test the merchandise, Elizabeth recalled, her voice dropping to a whisper. Some would shout suddenly, others would purposely spill drinks or drop items. The worst ones would strike without warning. If you flinched or made a sound, you failed the examination and returned to the cellar for additional conditioning. As Elizabeth's testimony and Thompson's records were correlated, investigators began identifying and locating children who had been successfully placed in previous years. Federal marshals, working with local authorities, conducted discreet inquiries at dozens of wealthy households throughout Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. The results confirmed their worst fears. Thompson's graduates were working as servants in some of the most prestigious homes in the region, including those of judges, legislators, and business leaders. The recovery of these placed children presented unique challenges. Many had been thoroughly conditioned to accept their circumstances and initially resisted rescue attempts. Others had developed complex psychological adaptations to their captivity, forming attachments to their owners that defied simple explanation. Some had been resold multiple times, making them difficult to trace through conventional records. One such case involved a boy named Thomas, originally sold by Thompson in 1833 at age 12 to a Richmond merchant. When marshals located him 6 years later, Thomas was working as a household servant for a prominent judge. His initial reaction to the investigators was terror, not of his current situation, but of being returned to what he called the training place. Like many of Thompson's victims, Thomas had developed a worldview in which his conditioning had been a necessary preparation for his role in society. As these recoveries continued throughout October and November of 1839, a disturbing pattern emerged regarding the buyers of Thompson's merchandise. They were not, for the most part, the cruel sadists one might expect. Many appeared genuinely shocked when confronted with the origins of their servants. They had accepted Thompson's explanation that he operated a special training academy for orphan children, preparing them for domestic service as an act of charity that simultaneously provided them with life skills and respectable employment. Nevertheless, the fundamental exploitation remained undeniable. These employers had welcomed the unnaturally submissive behavior of children who never complained, never requested wages, and worked with mechanical precision. They had chosen not to question why children flinched at sudden movements or why they never spoke unless directly addressed. The comfortable self-deception of the privileged classes had enabled Thompson's operation to flourish for 15 years. The investigation took a dramatic turn in late October when marshals, acting on information from Thompson's correspondence, raided a property in western Maryland owned by a man named Ezekiel Harrington. Like Thompson, Harrington was a respected community figure who had presented himself as a philanthropist, operating a special educational facility for disadvantaged children. The raid revealed 17 children being held in conditions similar to those at Elmwood, though the facility was above ground and disguised as a legitimate school. Harrington's arrest established the first concrete proof of a coordinated network. His records contained regular correspondence with Thompson dating back to 1829, discussing methods of conditioning, market conditions, and the exchange of particularly promising students. More importantly, Harrington's papers contained references to at least 4 other operations in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, each using similar methods and sharing resources. Marshall Hartwell, recognizing the expanded scope of the investigation, requested additional federal resources. "We are not dealing with isolated criminals," he wrote to his superiors in Washington, "but with an organized enterprise that has infiltrated respectable society and corrupted legitimate institutions." The Thompson case represents merely one node in a network that spans multiple states and involves individuals from all levels of society. The public reaction to these expanding revelations was complex and often contradictory. Initial horror at the Elmwood discovery had been followed by a period of collective soul-searching in Millfield, with community members struggling to understand how they had failed to recognize what was happening in their midst. As the investigation revealed connections to prominent families and institutions, however, a troubling strain of denial began to emerge. Some community leaders questioned whether the children's accounts could be trusted. Others suggested that Thompson, while clearly guilty of mistreatment, had perhaps been motivated by misguided philanthropic intentions rather than pure malice. The most disturbing response came from certain wealthy families who had purchased Thompson's graduates, some of whom began advancing the argument that the children were better off having received training that made them employable. Against this backdrop of rationalization and denial, Dr. Sarah Blackwell emerged as a powerful advocate for the victims. One of the few female physicians practicing in Virginia at that time, Dr. Blackwell had been called from Richmond to assist with the medical care of the rescued children. Her clinical observations quickly evolved into passionate advocacy. "What I have witnessed is not merely physical abuse, but the systematic destruction of human identity," she wrote in a report that would be published in several major newspapers. "These children have been conditioned to view themselves as objects, rather than persons, to suppress all natural emotions and impulses, and to exist solely for the convenience of others. This is not education or training. It is the methodical eradication of the human spirit." Dr. Blackwell's involvement shifted public discourse away from abstract legal questions toward the human reality of the children's suffering. Her detailed medical documentation of their physical conditions, the carefully inflicted injuries designed to cause maximum pain without permanent disability, the calculated malnutrition that kept them weak but functional, the evidence of prolonged restraint and confinement, made it impossible to maintain comfortable illusions about Thompson's motives or methods. As autumn deepened into winter, the rescued children faced the enormous challenge of recovery. Physical healing progressed relatively quickly under proper medical care, but psychological rehabilitation proved far more difficult. Many children struggled with basic concepts of autonomy and self-determination after years of conditioning. Simple decisions about food preferences or clothing choices could trigger panic attacks. Some maintained their chalk boundaries even after being moved to comfortable accommodations, sleeping on the floor beside their beds rather than in them. Perhaps most heartbreaking was their difficulty with spontaneous expression. Children who had been punished for years for showing emotion or speaking without permission now struggled to articulate their needs or feelings. Some communicated primarily through indirect means, drawings, gestures, or proxy objects. Others spoke only when directly questioned, responding in the formal, stilted language Thompson had drilled into them. The most severely affected children exhibited what Dr. Blackwell termed conditional existence. They seemed unable to perceive themselves as having value or purpose except in relation to serving others. When not given specific tasks or instructions, they would stand motionless, sometimes for hours, waiting for commands. Some became visibly distressed by expressions of affection or attempts to engage them in play or normal childhood activities. Elizabeth Collins, whose testimony had been so valuable to investigators, demonstrated remarkable resilience compared to many others. Dr. Blackwell's notes attributed this to several factors. Elizabeth had been slightly older when captured, had maintained some secret practices of resistance during her captivity, and had been assigned supervisory duties that preserved a small measure of autonomy. Her progress became a source of hope for those working with the other children. By November, a specialized recovery facility had been established in a former country estate donated by a wealthy Richmond family seeking to make amends for having unknowingly purchased one of Thompson's graduates. The Sycamore Haven Recovery Home, as it was named, combined medical care, psychological support, educational opportunities, and vocational training tailored to each child's needs and capabilities. The approach developed at Sycamore Haven would later be recognized as revolutionary for its time, a comprehensive, trauma-informed model that recognized the children's need to reclaim their identities and rebuild their understanding of themselves and the world. Rather than rushing academic education, the program focused initially on establishing safety, developing self-regulation skills, and reconnecting children with their natural interests and abilities. Small victories were celebrated as significant milestones: a child expressing a food preference, another laughing spontaneously at a joke, a third making a decision without seeking permission. The staff maintained detailed records of these moments, creating what would become an invaluable resource for understanding trauma recovery in later decades. As the children's recovery progressed, the legal proceedings against Jeremiah Thompson moved forward. The preliminary hearing in October had established overwhelming evidence of multiple crimes, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault, and trafficking. Thompson had maintained his composure during these proceedings, offering no defense beyond the insistence that he had provided structure and purpose to children who would otherwise have been abandoned by society. The trial itself began on December 4, 1839, in the Alleghany County Courthouse. The proceedings attracted national attention, with newspapers from as far away as Boston and Charleston sending correspondents to cover what was being described as the most shocking crime in the young nation's history. Public interest was so intense that special arrangements were made to accommodate spectators, with the courthouse doors opening 2 hours before proceedings began each day. Thompson's defense strategy, directed by a team of expensive lawyers hired by mysterious benefactors, focused on questioning the reliability of testimony from damaged children and positioning Thompson as a misunderstood reformer whose methods, while perhaps severe by conventional standards, were designed to provide valuable life skills to society's cast-offs. This approach met with little success, particularly after Elizabeth Collins took the stand. Now healthier and more confident. After 2 months of proper care, Elizabeth provided damning testimony about daily life in the cellar. Speaking in a clear, steady voice that occasionally dropped to a whisper when recounting particularly traumatic events, she methodically dismantled the defense's portrayal of Thompson as a stern but well-intentioned educator. He would tell us, "We were fortunate when he hurt us," she testified. "He said pain was our teacher and would make us valuable. Sometimes he would make us thank him afterward." Those who couldn't or wouldn't were taken to the special room and often didn't return. The prosecution also presented physical evidence that contradicted Thompson's educational claims. Not a single book, slate, or writing implement had been found in the cellar. No educational materials of any kind existed among the extensive records and supplies. Instead, investigators had discovered implements of restraint and punishment, including specialized devices that Thompson had apparently designed himself to maximize control and compliance. Dr. Blackwell's expert testimony proved particularly devastating to the defense. Combining medical evidence with emerging psychological theory, she explained how Thompson's methods represented not education, but systematic dehumanization. She described in clinical detail how prolonged captivity, isolation, and calculated trauma had been used to break down natural human resistance and create artificial submission. The children found at Elmwood were not being prepared for independent, productive lives, she testified. They were being methodically reduced to human tools, conditioned to serve without question, to endure abuse without complaint, and to exist solely for the convenience and profit of others. The most dramatic moment in the trial came when Prosecutor William Chambers revealed the full scope of Thompson's operation through his own meticulous records. Presenting ledgers spanning 15 years, Chambers demonstrated that Thompson had processed over 100 children through his program, generating profits exceeding $30,000. This was not the misguided project of a social reformer, Chambers told the jury during his closing argument. This was a calculated business enterprise that trafficked in human lives and profited from human suffering. Mr. Thompson did not see children in need of education. He saw commodities to be acquired, processed, and sold for maximum profit. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. On December 21, 1839, Judge Hiram Montgomery sentenced Jeremiah Thompson to death by hanging, scheduling the execution for January 15, 1840. In delivering the sentence, Montgomery departed from judicial convention by directly addressing the moral dimensions of the case. In my 30 years on the bench, I have encountered many forms of human depravity, he stated. But never have I seen evil so calculated, so sustained, or so profitable as that which you have practiced. You have not merely broken laws, you have violated the most fundamental principles of human decency and exploited society's most vulnerable members for personal gain. Thompson's response to the sentence revealed the first crack in his composed facade. Rising to his feet, he addressed the court in a voice that witnesses described as unnervingly calm yet underlaid with rage. You understand nothing of what I have accomplished. These children were nothing, abandoned, unwanted, destined for lives of poverty and degradation. I gave them purpose and function in a world that had no place for them. History will recognize the value of my methods when your sentimental objections are long forgotten. This outburst, widely reported in newspapers across the country, crystallized public perception of Thompson as a monster attempting to disguise predation as philanthropy. Any lingering sympathy or confusion about his motives largely evaporated in the face of his evident lack of remorse. As 1839 drew to a close, the Thompson case had expanded far beyond the original discovery at Elmwood. Federal investigations now extended into 5 states, with dozens of arrests and the rescue of nearly 50 additional children from similar operations. The network Thompson had helped to build was being systematically dismantled, though investigators recognized that many participants remained unidentified and at large. For the children of Elmwood, the new year brought continued progress in their long journey toward recovery. The Sycamore Haven program reported encouraging developments, children beginning to engage in spontaneous play, forming healthy attachments to caregivers, and gradually reclaiming aspects of normal childhood that had been stolen from them. These small victories, set against the backdrop of unimaginable trauma, testified to the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of calculated efforts to destroy it. As the investigation continued to uncover connections between Thompson's operation and supposedly respectable society, questions arose that extended far beyond the fate of one criminal or the recovery of his victims. How had such systematic exploitation flourished undetected for so long? What weaknesses in social institutions and human perception had enabled Thompson and his associates to operate with impunity? And most importantly, what changes were needed to ensure that such horrors could not recur? The answers to these questions would emerge gradually over the coming months as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The Thompson case would eventually force American society to confront uncomfortable truths about the vulnerability of children, the exploitation enabled by social inequality, and the ease with which evil could hide behind respectable facades when protected by wealth and social position. For those who had witnessed the children's condition upon their rescue from the cellar, no legal punishment could possibly match the magnitude of Thompson's crimes. Justice in this case would not be found merely in his execution, but in the systemic changes his exposure might prompt, changes that could protect future generations from similar exploitation. As winter settled over Virginia and the new year approached, the 23 children of Elmwood faced the challenge of rebuilding lives that had been systematically dismantled. Their journey would continue long after public attention had moved. On to other matters, a quiet testament to the human capacity for healing, even after experiencing the darkest aspects of human cruelty. The true measure of justice in the Thompson case would ultimately lie not in the punishment of one man, but in society's commitment to ensuring that no child could ever again disappear into a hidden cellar, forgotten by a world too comfortable with convenient explanations and too willing to look away from disturbing possibilities. The children of Elmwood, through their suffering and survival, had exposed not just one man's crimes, but an entire system's failures that demanded recognition and reform if their ordeal was to have any meaning beyond tragedy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.